Welcome, friends. Thank you for joining me today. Today I'm featuring part two of the My Monthly Hero Arts kit for June, the Northern Lights. Card number 6 is an A2 card. For my panel, I started with 65-pound Nina White cardstock. I ink blended Dusty Concord, Abandoned Coral, and squeezed lemonade onto the panel, creating an evening sunset. I used a Post-it note to hold my panel in place and also to protect my fingers from the ink and smearing the ink. I centered a stitched rectangle die onto my 4¼ by 5½ inch panel and die cut it to form a frame. I cut a piece of craft foam slightly smaller than the center panel and affixed that to the panel. A little ahead of myself, I meant to heat emboss my focal panel with the eagle, the star, and the moon, and add my sentiment before mounting it to craft foam. But using the MISTI, it came out just fine. I heat embossed my images with VersaFine Onyx Black ink and clear embossing powder. I used Gina K Amalgam ink for my sentiment. And in retrospect, I should have used the VersaFine Onyx Black and heat embossed it. It came out okay. I did use a sentiment from a past Hero Arts kit. And then I finished off the card by adding a frame from the MFT Dynamics die set. I added a white frame, just one layer, and affixed that to my 110-pound white card base. I then mounted my inner blended frame and panel, focal panel, to the white card base. Afterwards, I used Purple Rain Nuvo glitter drops to add a little more interest to this panel. And this card is done. Card number 7 is an A2 card. I heat embossed the large background stamp onto Hero Hues pumpkin cardstock using Hero Arts Unicorn White pigment ink and clear embossing powder for a heat resist technique. The effects of the heat embossing were very cool. It appeared almost raspberry in color. Love it. Next, I used the Summer Twilight palette of reactive inks from the August 2020 kit and just rubbed that across, or really down, my panel and filled in areas that I missed by using like the edge or the tip of the palette so that I didn't do too much cross contamination. Next, I used the lacquer pen glow in the dark that came in the kit to just trace out some of the larger lines or light lines in the panel. Off camera, I stamped and die cut my whale and the tail out of light blue cardstock and used Versamark and alabaster white embossing powder. I also stamped my sentiment thinking of you from a past kit. I stamped that onto black cardstock and heat embossed that with the Brutus Monroe alabaster white embossing powder also, and just used my scissors to trim that down. I added a few sequins from a past Hero Arts kit. I believe it was a kit with the fairies back a few years ago, or about a year ago. I cut an oval frame from navy blue cardstock and affixed that on top of my panel. The effects of the unicorn white pigment ink and clear embossing powder on the Hero Hues pumpkin cardstock are very interesting and created quite a bit of texture. I like it. Card number 8 is a slimline card that measures 3 3/4 by 8 1/2. For my panel, I used Kansan XL watercolor paper and Nouveau shimmer powders, Blue Blitz, and Solar Flare. I taped my panel down to a board and using painter's tape and lightly sprinkled my Solar Flare and Blue Blitz onto the panel, and then liberally applied water and used a paper towel to soak up the excess. Before applying water, I used a dry brush to remove some of the Solar Flare shimmer powder that had gone beyond my imaginary horizon line. To get richer color, I applied the shimmer powders again, spritzed with water, and soaked up the excess with the paper towel. I die cut my lighthouse from white cardstock and black cardstock, and I applied double-sided tape, 1/8 of an inch tape, to the lighthouse and removed that and trimmed it down. And then I used my Wow All That Jazz glitter. This is a very beautiful glitter. I used that on the lighthouse on top of the double-sided tape. And I covered the lighthouse and the glitter with my copier paper and used my bone folder to burnish it in, just to kind of set the glitter. Used my dry paintbrush to remove the excess glitter and decided I wanted to add another strip. And so I repeated the process for that last strip of double-sided tape. Next, I used my MFT Sunray stencil and unicorn white pigment ink to create rays of sun on the top part of my panel. And you'll notice I'm pouncing the tool. Instead of rubbing it, I found that I was able to apply more ink using the pouncing versus just brushing it on. I used the Hero Arts Wave Stencil and Tumbled Glass Distress Oxide ink just to give it a little more texture at the bottom of the panel. Removing my stencil and letting the panel completely dry, I used Distress Micro Glaze to set the shimmer powders so that they don't bleed. Then I'm rubbing it off with a paper towel. Next, I cut my lighthouse from the base and affixed it to the black lighthouse base. I affixed a partial mountain to my scene. I stamped my sentiment using Versamark ink and Brutus Monroe Alabaster White embossing powder. I stamped it on black cardstock. I also stamped my whale, a head and tail on white cardstock using VersaFine Onyx black ink and clear embossing powder. Next, I trimmed my sentiment out with my scissors. I affixed my sentiment and my whale to the panel. Then I used Trinity Slimline dies to cut out a frame for my panel. I cut the frame out of white cardstock and affixed it to my panel, then mounted my panel to 110-pound white cardstock. Card number 9 is also a slimline card. I used the Trinity Slimline dies to cut out a panel that measures 3.5 by 8.5. It's a stitched panel. I placed a 65-pound Nina White piece of cardstock in my MISTI to stamp my spouts, water spouts. I stamped them in Distress Oxide inks and heat embossed them with clear embossing powder. I used Blueprint Sketch, Dusty Concord, Picked Raspberries, Twisted Citron, Squeezed Lemonade, Ripe Persimmon, and Firebrick Red. After die cutting those out, I cut off the head from all of the spouts except the Blueprint Sketch. I also stamped a tail in Blueprint Sketch. Next, I stamped my sentiment onto my panel using VersaFine Onyx black ink and clear embossing powder. I formed the sentiment into a curve because I wanted a whimsical look for this card. I used the Hero Arts Wave Stencil and tumbled glass at the bottom of my panel to form my ocean. And then I took my tumbled glass all the way up the panel, but stopped just underneath the "You Are Wonderful" sentiment. Then I sprinkled water on top of my panel, blotted that off with a paper towel to create a more textured look. I used my heat tool to speed up the drying process, and then I placed all of my water spouts in rainbow order onto my panel and turned them in different directions to create more interest. And then I used craft tacky glue to affix them to my panel. I used buttons galore and more rhinestones to add a little bit of shimmer to this panel. Overall, I'm pleased with the look of this card. I mounted my panel to 110-pound white cardstock, and that finishes this card. Card number 10 is a slimline card that measures 3 3/4 by 8.5. inches. I made this card off camera. I die cut my focal panel from 65-pound Nina White cardstock using Trinity stitched slimline dies. I used the Hero Arts wave stencil and Salty Ocean Distress Oxide ink to make my water scene. And I cut a mountain out of black cardstock from a past Hero Arts kit and used unicorn white ink for the peaks of that mountain. I also stamped my sky using tumbled glass Distress Oxide ink and splashed water on it to get the reaction and dried that off with a paper towel. I stamped my sentiment, sending a splash of love that was from a past kit. I stamped that using VersaFine Onyx Black ink. I heat embossed that with clear embossing powder. I trimmed down my water spouts, added them to my card from darkest to lightest is what I tried to do, and cut off the tips or the heads like I did in card number 9. I affixed those to my panel along with the whale's tail. I mounted my panel onto a 110-pound black card base. I added Nuvo Morning Dewdrops to my panel to give it a little interest. I added a white panel on the inside so that I can write or stamp my message. That's it for this card. Now let's take a look at all of the cards I made in this video. Please take a moment and comment to let me know which card you like best. If you like this video, please like and subscribe to my channel. Thank you so much for joining me today. Until next time, good day, friends.